more material in a sense. I would like to do things more in New York because I live here, and but I find that it's in the museums basically either there's a kind of sort of kind of a gala retrospective in one of the museums, or there's a group show in which you're a pawn in the curator's career, right? This is basically, you become really your work becomes used in a very particular way, which isn't, sometimes it could be useful and it's sometimes interesting, but and that's of course not just limited to New York, but these are the ways in which, I can show, or I can, show at my gallery, show, with Leo, and which I've done, I've had 4 shows maybe.
Yes. Mm-hmm.
And that's basically been, my experience showing in New York. Also, I guess because I know younger artists, I always feel that it seems as though I'm always hearing about the difficulty of finding places to show and stuff, and it seems I almost would rather prefer to leave the gallery free for someone else in a way. Right?
The work of what other artists do you respond? Who's helped form your own vision?
Probably less artists than...
I'm talking about your summer reading with Smith.
Yeah, well, that's the problem. I mean, it's at different times, different people have had influence. Certainly, Judd had a big influence, even if he's not speaking to me now.
Is that art relevant?
No, I'm just gossiping. But I don't know what...
Well,
there are lots of artists. It's always difficult because when you point to one, they become more important than they ever were, right? When you mention them in that way, and important for different ways.
Saul LeWitt,
and yes, certainly.
Created environments that made.
Saul's very important for the sort of work which I've worked within. He did a lot of the, certain sense, a lot of the groundwork. I think, I see art quite differently than Saul does, and Saul, Saul's conceptions are, I've written about, whatever criticism I would have of Saul's or anyone else's work. I mean, I think that the critical edge that always gets people upset is really part of the activity, and that's the difference between New York and Europe, is that if you critique an artist's work, a fellow artist's work in New York, is considered bad-mouthing and politicking. In Europe, it's part of the way in which one, it's considered part of why you're interested in art, that you would do that, right? And that's part of it. That's the problem. Is it's probably that thing, that anti-intellectualism that's in America. There's a kind of, it's also a way in which art tendency, people seem to like decorative work, work which can really be more of a commodity and less sort of involved with ideas or issues or what I would say is basic to art itself, but of course.
It's your words rather than your attire that lead me to ask if Ad Reinhardt was a significant influence. Yes,
he was significant at a certain point in my, development, emotional development as much as anything else. I met him when I was a student at the Cleveland Art Institute, 18 years old or something. And he had a big, influence, not in terms of his work in a specific way, but really his attitude, that he really did consider, he was always on any panel he could be on, and he wrote a lot about art, and really stood for a certain idea of art within his generation. And he really created that informational context that made those black paintings mean something.
But also systematized.
Sure. Yeah. Well, I mean, granted. I mean, he was of his time. I wouldn't deny him that. But and to see him now as a formalist or a color painter on a very limited scale, which at a certain point I was afraid was going to happen to him. Fortunately, it didn't. It would be really to destroy the work. You see, I think work means. I think he was very careful in constructing a meaning for his work. I've always. Now, of course, my concerns and my orientation really eclipse thinking about, in any specific way, a work like Reinhardt's, or Judd's for that matter. But that's not the conversation we're having.
Mr. Judd has said, if someone calls it art, it is art. Would you agree with that formulation?
I not only agreed, I tried to help him by extending it in one of my articles.
And how did you extend that?
Do we have that much time left on this tape? I know better.
Can you tell us briefly?
Well, you know, in a certain sense, I made, I suppose, parallel references to it. That if that art is not defined morphologically. That is, it's not simply a basis of some kind of a priori demarcated forms, which make it possible for you to identify it as art. And I think that the attitude has been, and that's certainly is the European tradition of painting and sculpture, and this, of course, is what's so valuable about the sort of minimalist critique of it, was one where it was difficult to see art other than you know, within those terms, right? That those two, the painting and the sculpture, really defined the world in terms of art. And we began to realize that in fact, the art existed really in another strata, right? And that it wasn't simply in terms of its forms. And so that really anything can be art with, you know, if used in a meaningful way, meaningful in relation to art. Now, you know, I mean, that's going back about, you know, a certain point, the point at which Judd said that, and the point a bit after that when I responded to it, right? Obviously, you know, the conversation has continued, and I've said a lot of things since which really eclipse that argument, right? But that's, you know, long conversation. And it's much too hot here for that.
I guess there is no longer, in your view, such a thing as avant-garde thinking. That has been eclipsed.
There is, and I'm usually embarrassed by it when I see it.
What would you call it, post-vanguard rather than
avant-garde? Some people have said postmodern. I thought that was, you know, if it's more, you know, because really I think at a certain point I kind of realized that I maybe was in the first generation that was long enough, just because of our age, and was far enough away from Cubism to see it, right? I mean, for me, and almost Pollock, I mean, it's really, you know, just historically, got so far away from it that one never saw, I didn't see myself as part of, any more part of that tradition than in the kind of direct ways that, you know, even the abstract expressions, even perhaps like Roy and Bob, who still had some connection perhaps to people who came here after the war. And simply by my age, I didn't have those connections, right? And I had another kind of relationship with it, right? Which meant that one began to ask other kinds of questions, which perhaps as a critique were maybe more valuable. And certainly, I think this I say also perhaps ironically, but developed newer and other traditions.
You've said that Pollock and Judd represent the beginning and the end of American art.
But it always sounds like you're edged it in marble when you say it like that, doesn't it?
Marble.
Yeah, I take it back. I don't.
You can amend it. How much further will you go?
No, well, I mean, yeah, okay. I mean, in the sense that it's one idea of art, right? One idea of American art, which is that it's American art. It's the idea of American art in that sense. It's not that it's wrong. It's that I think probably other things should be discussed.
Leo, you've recently said that everything in painting and sculpture seems to have been done. You say that in the late 50s, too.
I'll take it back, too.
Is there anything
I'll
new?
say it instead, then.
Is there anything new?
No.
Oh, thank God we got that cleared once and for all.
You once said that you pick painters not only because they're good, but because they're leaders of a new movement. Is that...
That doesn't seem to apply anymore. That's why we are a little bit confused. No leaders seem to appear upon the scene.
That's good. Confusion's good, I think.
How would you characterize the contemporary period?
Well, the artists that emerged in the late 50s and in the 60s, many of them, go on doing their good work. Some even develop from where they began. For instance, people, we have the Jasper John show that I want to mention again, where people say, oh, he was so marvelous at the time when he painted the flags and the targets and the numbers. and now he does things that are by far not as good. I think just the contrary. I think that Johns is much better now than he ever was.
Why do you feel that?
Well, I just feel that way.
What leads you to that conclusion?
Well, just looking at his work.
What
do you
does it
think?
represent?
Would you?
Leave me out of this conversation.
And how would you characterize the contemporary period?
Well, I made some references. I really think that there is I think there's a real crisis in meaning, right? And I think artists are feeling it, particularly because of the nature of art making, and that the ways, the given avenues and traditions just simply don't seem to be satisfactory, right, for them. And I mean, there's lots of work, work which on an art level perhaps I don't find, dramatically interesting, but on other ways I find very important, such as performance and filmmaking. That I mean, I teach a lot, and I visit a lot of schools, and I find most of the brighter younger students are enormous percentage are either doing performance films, or they're not doing any work at all, and they're sitting trying to, it's one of those three things, and I think that's significant, huh? And it's difficult to know, I mean, Leo has a difficult job, I'm sure, at this point, to figure out how to see what to get a handle on what younger artists are doing. There's a lot more work being done collaboratively, right? Which is a real problem for instance, for the art market, because there's no longer that we've been brought up in this kind of Messianic tradition, also part of male ideology, but this idea of the great hero, the great individual artist, and we've internalized it, we believe it, and it's very. And to think collaborative work screws all that up, because who's what I mean. You want to find out who's the master, the hero there, and it has to do more with the working relationships between the artists, right? So it's something which it's finding a value in another level. So these things are it is in a state of flux. I find it healthy, and I find it forces me to reconsider lots of aspects of my work that I might not have if I'd be relating to another generation, perhaps, right? But I have to.
Perhaps you could give Leo and the rest of us a clue. What is the future direction of your work?
Well, no, isn't that? I mean, we don't want to ask that at the end of this tape, do we?
Predictable and interesting.
It's trying to. I'm trying to undermine my own tradition, right? At the same time, I extend it. How's that?
And what is the next extension? Because I was thinking of the dictionary pages, the large black and white
That's very old work.
I understand, but you said you abandoned that when photography became certainly accepted within the traditional art forum. Where are you extending your work now? How important is video to your work? Performance?
None. I mean, I did one video thing, but the thing is the show I'm doing in Eindhoven, the museum, Van Abbe Museum in Eindhoven the end of late, yeah, right. Thank you. I'm trying to do is, and I don't know if I'm going to succeed, but I'm trying to do work in the area, which would develop meaning, independent of the show, right, which will occur before, so that it will mean something other than what it will mean when it's in the show, right? And that's, one of those self-character, it's like synopsizing it or caricaturizing it in such a way that I probably won't do it now that I've said that, But that's the problem with interviews, frankly, and that's part of the reason I didn't want to answer it, right? Because,
easily exercised, unless the work is given meaning.
Exorcise or exercise?
Both.
Yeah.
Unless the work is given meaning by its criticism.
Well, you see, that's what I mean when I said earlier that one will, you do something knowing that it's going to fail, and in its failure, you will see something, right? This is very unsatisfactory. This description, and it's the problem that comes from sort of trying to kind of nutshellize what you're doing, and you can't. I mean, it's like self-sloganizing, right? And I become more and more resistant to doing that as I go on. I'm waffling. Let's just leave it at a nice waffle, shall we say?
Obviously, it is very difficult to talk in shorthand and code, but you've certainly been very generous in trying to explain your work and your philosophy, to share your views with us. Thank you very much, Joseph Kosuth and Leo Castelli. If there are any questions,
I'm sorry.
if you would please raise your hand. And we'll send-
I would like to know when Mr. Kosuth is showing what he has recent work.
Leo, you'd like, the woman, thank you, in the center asked, where can Mr. Kosuth's work be seen? She's interested in seeing it.
At my gallery, some, not much.
In your gallery?
In my gallery downtown at 420 West Broadway. What I can always show you is documentary material. I've got plenty of that. Actual pieces are, except for those that are simple to take out from the rack and lean against the wall, are difficult to see because
they're installations.
And a special
Yeah.
installation.
Yeah.
But you can
But there is
see
a great deal
everything
of
that is
photographic
done.
documentation that I think helps
Yeah.
to clarify and explain the nature of
Yeah.
the work. And there are, you've written so extensively, and I consider that an integral part of understanding your work, that it is almost astonishing for one so young to have shown as extensively and to have written as extensively. Are there
But
any-
anyway, I repeat, documentary material is at anybody's disposal in a quiet
It's a
room
wonderful new
at the
word,
gallery.
and you would invite that, wouldn't you? Because it requires consideration. Are there any other questions? Yes, sir.
Mr. Castelli, how important is the role of the dealer in creating the fame of the artist, and how do you determine the price structure of the new work?
How do I determine what? Did you get that?
Price structure. M-O-N-E-Y.
Oh God, the prices to begin with for work that doesn't sell very much, like all the work of the conceptualists, is totally arbitrary. In other cases, of course, there is a market. There are market forces that establish prices. You, as in everything else, scarcity, demand, etc. Determine then little by little the prices. It's a very slow process. It's a natural one. There is nothing arbitrary about that.
Leo, I think in that question there is always, if I may extend it, not trying to project into your mind, but there is always implicit in that question is those market forces, how collusive they are, just what forces arrange themselves.
Well, let's suppose the work of two artists, just to give you an example. One would be Liechtenstein, who produces a lot, and one would be just the Johns, who produces very little. They are both very desirable. Liechtenstein prices tend to go up less than John's prices because there is a larger supply. It's as simple as all that.
No, but in particular, the work of a new artist, someone who's...
Well, there is sort of a basic price that you ask for a painting, say 4 by 6 or 6 by 4, let's say $1,200. Everybody, I think, every gallery in New York has more or less that price for a painting of a given size, or let's say $350 for a drawing, or $250, depending on how much faith you have in the artist.
And how much the buyer wants.
Yes, it's again the demand, of course. If there are 3 or 4 or 5 people who seem to be terribly desirous to have those drawings, then the prices go up immediately.
The other part of my question is what part does the dealer play in creating the fame of the artist?
In creating what?
In creating the fame of the artist.
The fame of the artist? Well, just by exhibiting his work. But I would say, especially by his faith and enthusiasm. If that's lacking, if this is only the dealer just indulges in a commercial operation, he won't create any fame whatsoever. There has to be really that messianic kind of ardor that you have to have in order to create a fame for an artist. For instance, I haven't sold much of Joseph's work, but I certainly do believe in it enormously. It's just difficult to sell here in America, and well, that's what the situation is. I can't do anything about it, but I do believe in him. And therefore, actually, he appears often in group shows. I speak about him very often. Whenever we discuss important developments, artists that have come up recently or in the past 10 years, certainly Joseph is one of the first that I would mention, together with a few others, of course. Now you see, even your enthusiasm and your faith won't do the trick. There have perhaps to be other elements present, perhaps the fact that people still stick to traditional forms of expression.
Thank you again, Joseph Kosuth and Leo Castelli. Thank you for being with us. Our guest next week is Robert Motherwell.